A reading from the book of Judges. Today is August 19th. Our reading from Judges is chapter 20. Thereupon all the Israelites from Dan to Beersheba and from the land of Gilead marched forth, and the community assembled to a man before the Lord at Mizpah. All the leaders of the people and all the tribes of Israel presented themselves in the assembly of God's people, 400,000 fighting men on foot. The Benjaminites heard that the Israelites had come up to Mizpah. The Israelites said, "Tell us, how did this evil thing happen?" And the Levite, the husband of the murdered woman, replied, "My concubine and I came to Gibeah of Benjamin to spend the night. The citizens of Gibeah set out to harm me. They gathered against me around the house in the night. They meant to kill me, and they ravaged my concubine until she died. So I took hold of my concubine, and I cut her in pieces and sent them through every part of Israel's territory. For an outrageous act of depravity had been committed in Israel. Now you are all Israelites. Produce a plan of action here and now." Then all the people rose as one man and declared, "We will not go back to our homes. We will not enter our houses. But this is what we will do to Gibeah. We will wage war against it according to lot. We will take from all the tribes of Israel 10 men to the 100, 100 to the 1,000, and 1,000 to the 10,000 to supply provisions for the troops, to prepare for their going to Gibeah in Benjamin, for all the outrage it has committed in Israel." So all the men of Israel, united as one man, massed against the town. And the tribes of Israel sent men through the whole tribe of Benjamin, saying, "What is this evil thing that has happened among you? Come, hand over those scoundrels in Gibeah, so that we may put them to death and stamp out the evil from Israel." But the Benjaminites would not yield to the demand of their fellow Israelites. So the Benjaminites gathered from their towns to Gibeah in order to take the field against the Israelites. On that day, the Benjaminites mustered from the towns 26,000 fighting men, mustered apart from the inhabitants of Gibeah, 700 picked men of all this force. 700 picked men were left-handed. Every one of them could sling a stone at a hare and not miss. The men of Israel, other than the Benjaminites, mustered 400,000 fighting men, warrior to a man. They proceeded to Bethel and inquired of God. The Israelites asked, "Who of us shall advance first to fight the Benjaminites?" And the Lord replied, "Judah first." So the Israelites arose in the morning and encamped against Gibeah. The men of Israel took the field against the Benjaminites. The men of Israel drew up in battle order against them at Gibeah. But the Benjaminites issued from Gibeah, and that day they struck down 22,000 men of Israel. Now the army, the men of Israel, rallied and again drew up in battle order at the same place as they had on the first day. For the Israelites had gone up and wept before the Lord until evening. They had inquired of the Lord, "Shall we again join battle with our kinsmen, the Benjaminites?" And the Lord replied, "March against them." The Israelites advanced against the Benjaminites on the second day, but the Benjaminites came out from Gibeah against them on the second day and struck down 18,000 more of the Israelites, all of them fighting men. Then the Israelites, all the army, went up and came to Bethel, and they sat there, weeping before the Lord. They fasted that day until evening and presented burnt offerings and offerings of well-being to the Lord. The Israelites inquired of the Lord, for the ark of God's covenant was there in those days, and Phinehas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron, the priest ministered before him in those days. "Shall we again take the field against our kinsmen the Benjaminites, or shall we not?" The Lord answered, "Go up, for tomorrow I will deliver them into your hands." Israel put men in ambush against Gibeah on all sides, and on the third day the Israelites went up against the Benjaminites as before and engaged them in battle at Gibeah. The Benjaminites dashed out to meet the army and were drawn away from the town onto the roads, of which one runs to Bethel and the other to Gibeah. As before, they started out by striking some of the men dead in the open field, about 30 men of Israel. The Benjaminites thought, "They are being routed before us as previously," but the Israelites had planned, "We will take to flight and draw them away from the town to the roads." And while the main body of the Israelites had moved away from their positions and had drawn up in battle order at Baal Tamar, the Israelite ambush was rushing out from its position at Mareh Geba. Thus 10,000 picked men of all Israel came to a point south of Gibeah, and the battle was furious. Before they realized that disaster was approaching, the Lord routed the Benjaminites before Israel. That day the Israelites slew 25,100 men of Benjamin, all of them fighting men. Then the Benjaminites realized that they were routed. Now the Israelites had yielded ground to the Benjaminites, for they relied on the ambush which they had laid against Gibeah. One ambush quickly deployed against Gibeah, and the other ambush advanced and put the whole town to the sword. A time had been agreed upon by the Israelite men with those in ambush. When a huge column of smoke was sent up from the town, the Israelite men were to turn about in battle. Benjamin had begun by striking dead about 30 Israelite men, and they thought, "They are being routed before us as in the previous fighting." But when the pillar of smoke, began to rise from the city, the Benjaminites looked behind them, and there was the whole town going up in smoke to the sky. And now the Israelites turned about, and the men of Benjamin were thrown into panic, for they realized that disaster had overtaken them. They retreated before the men of Israel along the road to the wilderness, where the fighting caught up with them. Meanwhile, those from the towns were massacring them in it. They encircled Benjaminites, pursued them, and trod them down from Manoah to a point opposite Gibeah on the east. That day 18,000 men of Benjamin fell, all of them brave men. They turned and fled to the wilderness, to the rock of Rimmon. But the Israelites picked off another 5,000 on the road, and, continuing in hot pursuit of them, up to Gittim, they slew 2,000 more. Thus the total number of Benjaminites who fell that day came to 25,000 fighting men, all of them brave. But 600 men turned and fled to the wilderness, to the rock of Rimmon. They remained at the rock of Rimmon 4 months. The men of Israel, meanwhile, turned back to the rest of the Benjaminites and put them to the sword. Towns, people, cattle, everything that remained. Finally, they set fire to all the towns that were left.